Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Berkeley Center for New Media's Commons Conversation. My name is Gail DeKosnik, and I am an associate professor in the Berkeley Center for New Media, which we call BCNM, and also I'm also in theater, dance, and performance studies. And I'm currently the director of BCNM as well. BCNM is an interdisciplinary research center that studies and shapes media transition and emergence from diverse perspectives. Through critical thinking and making, we cultivate technological fairness and equity in our classrooms, in our communities, and on the internet. BCNM is committed to promoting technological equity and justice, and as such, our free events are inclusive, respectful, and harassment-free spaces. We invite everyone to participate by responding to tonight's lecture in the chat or in the Q&A portion, and we ask that attendees help us maintain a respectful space. Attendees who violate our guidelines will be removed from the event and may be disallowed from future online events. If you are new to our events, welcome. We will share a link to our community agreements in the chat. Before we begin, we would like to take a moment to honor the land. We recognize that Berkeley is located in the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded lands of Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone peoples, specifically the Confederated Villages of Lishan. The history of prolific technological development in this region has always depended on this land, and all of our technological infrastructures and activities take place on and in relation to this land. We commit to supporting the sovereignty and ongoing stewardship of this place by Ohlone peoples through building long-term reciprocity and relationships with tribal leaders and organizations. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Wendy Hui Kyong Chun as part of BCNM's Commons Conversations series. Dr. Chun is the Canada 150 Research Chair in New Media at Simon Fraser University and leads the Digital Democracies Institute, which was launched in 2019. The Institute aims to integrate research in the humanities and data sciences to address questions of equality and social justice in order to combat the proliferation of online echo chambers, abusive language, discriminatory algorithms, and misinformation and disinformation by fostering critical and creative user practices and alternative paradigms for connection. Dr. Chun is also the author of Updating to Remain the Same, Habitual New Media from 2016, Programmed Vision, Software and Memory from 2011, and Control and Freedom, Power and Paranoia in the Age of Fiber Optics from 2006, as well as numerous articles and edited collections. Today, we are here to talk about her latest book, Discriminating Data. In Discriminating Data, Dr. Chun reveals how polarization is a goal, not an error, within big data and machine learning. These methods, she argues, encode segregation, eugenics, and identity politics through their default assumptions and conditions. Correlation, which grounds big data's predictive potential, stems from 20th century eugenic attempts to breed a better future. Recommender systems foster angry clusters of sameness through homophily. Users are trained to become authentically predictable via a politics and technology of recognition. Machine learning and data analytics thus seek to disrupt the future by making disruption impossible. How can we release ourselves from the vice-like grip of discriminatory data? Dr. Chun calls for alternative algorithms, defaults, and interdisciplinary coalitions in order to desegregate networks and foster a more democratic big data. I am so pleased to welcome Wendy to the Berkeley Center for New Media. Let's take a moment to welcome her and thank her for her participation tonight.
Thank you so much, Gail, for that introduction and for having me here. It's such a pleasure to be part of the Commons series and to be part of this intimate book conversation. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Boston on the territory of the Massachusetts and their neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples. I extend my respect to citizens of these nations who live here today and their ancestors who have lived here for over 500 generations. I also want to thank you all for being here wherever here is for you, especially sharing Valentine's Day with me. So what I'm going to do is read a bit of the book first to give you a sense of it. So I'll read the preface as well as the beginning of the conclusion. So you'll get the bookends of the book. On December 6th, 1989, a man walked into an engineering classroom at the École Polytechnique in Montreal and ordered the men to leave. Thinking it was a prank to lighten the last day of class, no one moved, until he fired a single shot from his semi-automatic rifle. After the men left, he told the women he was there to fight feminism, and he opened fire on the women remaining in the room and in the adjoining hallways. He killed 14 women that day: Geneviève Bergeron, Hélène Colgan, Nathalie Cruteau, Barbara Dignon, Anne-Marie Edouard, Maud Havernick, Maryse Laganier, Maryse Leclerc, Anne-Marie Lemay, Sonia Pelletier, Michelle Richard, Annie Saint-Arnaud, Annie Turcotte, and Barbara Kluznik-Widajevic. I first heard about the massacre the next morning as I was sitting down to write my physical systems exam. The boys behind me asked me if I had heard about the women who were killed in an engineering classroom in Montreal. Thinking it was yet another sick and misogynist engineering joke, engineering was filled with them, I told them to shut up and write the exam. Later that day, when I found out that the massacre had actually happened, I was in shock. I had turned to engineering as a first-generation immigrant in Canada to escape from discrimination and politics. Disoriented, I turned to the humanities, to English literature and critical theory to help me acknowledge the violence and discrimination around me. Graduating as the first engineering student from the University of Waterloo with a double major, I then pursued a PhD in English literature at Princeton, initially as a way to run away from politics and discrimination. For any of you who know English departments, you will realize how misguided this was. Crucially, the first paper I wrote as a graduate student, one that became my first article, Unbearable Witness Towards a Politics of Listening, bore witness to the massacre and called for a politics of listening to supplement a politics of speaking. My question was, how can we redress the trauma, discrimination, and violence around us, not by treating anyone or any event as representative, but rather by acknowledging their singularity and our resonating experiences in our responses? When I started my PhD, I had dreams of merging literary theory and complex systems theory. I quickly moved from mapping the parallel between concepts in the humanities and engineering to asking what made these parallels possible and what these parallels responded to and enabled. I started writing about the importance of sex and sexuality to figuring connection on Usenet and this burgeoning thing called the World Wide Web. I started to realize that politics was necessary and already embedded in so much that I took for granted, from control systems that stem from gendered and racialized relations of dominance to server farms that threaten to destroy the world in their attempts to save everything. The humanities and critical theory gave me the language to see and address the inequalities around me, not because they were outside of them, but rather because they too suffered from these problems and were committed to redressing these issues. They gave me the strength to believe that another world was possible. For the last 25 years, I've been focused on understanding how the internet emerged as a mass medium to end mass media. I've used and developed new media theory to understand how a control technology was bought and sold as a technology of freedom. How software's emergence as a vapory thing encapsulated neoliberal dreams of programmability. How old media remain in our habits as we update to remain the same. Throughout, I've explored the centrality of race and sexuality to shaping technologies and to the bizarre and debilitating framing of technologies as solutions to profoundly political problems. I've also called for a close engagement with technologies and culture, not because I'm a technological or cultural determinist, but because I believe that engaging both intensely moves us away from either of these positions. The point is to see how they intersect and collide. That is, how drilling down into any technology reveals profound social and cultural assumptions, and vice versa. Discrimination and injustice do not come from outside. They're in there because technological defaults are embedded with cultural and social prejudices. At the same time, I've insisted that the traces of a different world are also in there. The limitations and vulnerabilities of technical control systems make it clear that freedom cannot be reduced to control. Freedom makes control necessary, but never enough. The vicissitudes of execution echo the lively world before us and undermine any dream of total solutions or programmability. New media, as I argued in Updating to Remain the Same, are wonderfully creepy. And our habits are shards of others contained within ourselves. Over the past years, I found myself turning back more and more to my engineering roots to discover these moments of possibility, as well as the ways in which eugenic and segregationist thinking have become integrated into our machines. The goal has been to bring engineering, computer science, humanities, social sciences, and arts together to take on the hard problems we face. This book reveals the communities and neighbors that haunt concepts of correlation, homophily, authenticity, and recognition that are so key to our current communication technologies. It seeks to remain with those whose traces make possible our own by confronting rather than running away from discrimination. Understanding that touch is neither banal nor always benign, it nonetheless starts from these relations in order to create different worlds in which we can live in difference, and in which freedom finally becomes meaningful because it's freedom for all. So that was the preface. And now you have to imagine that you read 250 pages or so, and I'll take you to the coda. So coda, living in difference. I started this book by outlining a 5-step program to counter the threat of hopeful ignorance. And hopeful ignorance is the idea that somehow technology will solve all these problems for us that we know has never happened. So the 5-step program is step number 1, expose and investigate how ignoring differences amplifies discrimination, both currently and historically. Step 2, interrogate the default assumptions and axioms that form the basis for algorithms and data structures. Step 3, apprehend the past, present, and future machine learning algorithms put in place to determine when, why, and how their predictions work. Step 4, use existing AI systems to diagnose current inequalities and to treat discriminatory predictions as evidence of past discrimination. Step 5, draw from struggles for and practices of desegregation and equality to displace the eugenic and segregationist defaults embedded within current network structures, and to devise different algorithms and modes of verification. And I'm going to skip the bit where I describe everything in detail in terms of the chapter summaries, and just end by reading this last section in the coda where I go over the main takeaways of the book. So the many observations presented in Discriminating Data, I want to underscore 8 in particular. 1, freedom is only freedom if it's freedom for all. Fears of an AI apocalypse and discriminatory technologies stem from the same source: inequality and profound misunderstandings of freedom as domination. Civil rights and liberties are not opposed. Coalitions, such as the one responsible for banning facial recognition technology in San Francisco, bear witness to this. The best way to prevent the coming singularity and combat algorithmic discrimination and pandemics is to treat everyone equally with dignity. Striving for a freedom that is no freedom will undermine democracy and lead to a bitter and paranoid liberation envy, which both identifies with and seeks to displace civil rights activists. Tellingly, thinking for yourself, taking the red pill, has become the passive act of being red-pilled. To dispel red pill toxicity, and there's a whole section in the book called Red Pill Toxicity, we need to engage the lives, dreams, and experiences of civil rights activists, not to inhabit them, but rather to build together the world they sought to inhabit. 2, reducing truth to consistency forecloses not just the present and the past, but also the future. Machine learning programs are not only trained on selected discriminatory and often dirty data, they're also verified as true only if they reproduce these data. These programs are tested on their ability to predict the past data hidden during the training phase, either from within the same set or out of sample, not the future. As Hannah Arendt has made clear, to define consistency as truth, as some modern logicians do, means to deny the existence of truth. To do so also forecloses the future. Global climate change models reveal the difference between truth and accuracy. To wait to see if any one given prediction is correct, in effect, is to lie down and rot. 3, majorities are now formed by disintegrating dominant groups into angry minorities, by divining and amplifying perceived stigmas, and then consolidating them together around a common enemy. This is hegemony in reverse. If hegemony once entailed creating a majority by various minorities accepting and identifying with a dominant worldview, majorities now emerge by consolidating angry minorities, each attached to a particular stigma through their opposition to quote-unquote mainstream culture. The goal of this hegemonic clustering is decidedly non-normative. From Fox News viewers who rail against the mainstream media, even though Fox News is the most popular channel on basic cable in the United States, to Silicon Valley Saurons who view themselves as underdogs. The norm has never become a normie. 4, authenticity as it is now understood renders humans as predictable as trees, but both are far more complicated than linear models presume. Algorithmic authenticity seeks to make us react predictably to triggers by encouraging us to act slightly badly. It condemns complexity and ambiguity as hypocrisy. Dramas and other performances of authenticity, however, reveal that we are more than marionettes. We are characters and actors. 5, big data is the bastard child of psychoanalysis and eugenics. Social media platforms seek to crack the human non-conscious in order to optimize mouse clicks and profits. Their aim is user desire, the unending move from one object to the next to keep users always wanting more. The relationship between network science, psychoanalysis, and ideology critique, however, also enables the kinds of unconventional interdisciplinary work needed to tackle behaviorist exploitation. As the leading science and technology studies scholar Donna Haraway reminds us, illegitimate offspring are often exceedingly unfaithful to their origins. Data analytics can enable us to engage what discriminatory data seek to foreclose. 6, correlation is correlation. Correlation is complicated. It's not simply a linear one-to-one relation. It condenses, displaces, multiplies. Proxies both poison and cure. 7, the past is as complex as the future. Our current archives can never serve as ground truth, for they're limited and biased. In the world of machine learning, ground truth equals deep think. As Saidiya Hartman and Ariella Azoulay have argued, historical archives exclude and buttress a logic of world-destroying progress. The past, though, is not lost, but rather a space of potential. 8, comfort and care are not comfortable. Homophilic spaces are often agitated spaces of comforting rage. To move beyond this, we need to acknowledge discomfort as a way to create new forms of connection and cohabitation. As Sarah Ahmed tells us, discomfort is not about assimilation or resistance, but about inhabiting norms differently. The inhabitants is generative or productive insofar as it does not end with a failure of norms to be secured, but with the possibilities of living that do not follow those norms through. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. It's been a tremendous honor and privilege to be able to read this book. And I've taken all my notes in old media. And so I'll be reading some of my thoughts, but also I encourage others to jump in by posting your questions in the Q&A box. And as soon as we have some questions populating that box, I'm going to read them, so don't feel like, you need to wait for the end of anything. I'm, doing a Q&A right now, basically. So please join into our Q&A by posting some of your questions. So, one thing I want to say about this book is that it's a great resource for pulling together research that's already been circulating, as well as your original research in telling the story of how we have arrived at a place where social media and algorithmic driven news and ads and feeds are playing major roles in dismantling our democracy and threatening the gains of the civil rights movements of the 20th century and, aiding fascism. So many people would say that every new technology causes disruption and that, they cause us, like a new media arises, the telegraph and photography arise, and they cause us, or they, not to use too techno-determinist language, but they facilitate a kind of reformulation of how we do democracy and how we do civil rights, and that, democracy and civil rights were never static. So, and they were never coherent and they were never whole. And so every new media, doesn't, sort of cause us to take up anew what we are doing when we do democracy or when we do civil rights or these massive social projects. So do you think, I think, I'm going to ask you a question that I feel like is just a common sort of question that people are asking each other, like practically on the street. It's like, what is different about this era of digital technology disrupting our democracy and our social rights movements? Like, in terms of the threats and affordances that they pose, what are the dramatic sorts of like unique threats and affordances of this era, as opposed to telegraphy, cinema, television? Let's hear some new media thinking around like, what is the new of this new media?
So I think that what's absolutely key in terms of difference, if we're going to talk about disruption, is that the goals of these technologies, if you think of predictive algorithms, for instance, is actually to make sure there is never disruption again. And this is why thinking through the relationship between the techniques embedded within machine learning and their origins within eugenics are absolutely key. Because the goal of eugenics and a lot of these technologies is to predict the future based on the past and to preempt that future so that there will be no different future. So in other words, if you think of what a lot of these predictive algorithms do, is that they ensure that past mistakes or injustices are automated rather than learned from. And this doesn't have to be like this. And one argument I make in the book is that we can treat a lot of these algorithms, which are now being used to predict and put in place a certain future, as actually ways to diagnose discrimination in the past. And so I argue that we should treat them like global climate change models, rather than saying, okay, when a global climate change model, for instance, shows us a 2-degree increase in temperature, we don't then say, okay, we accept this. They show us the most likely future given the past, so that we'll do something different. And so what we need is that gap between these predictions and the world, and preserving that gap is what's absolutely key.
There's like a deep irony in your writing in this book where you're constantly sort of reversing the stated definition of these popular techno terms, where you're basically saying like, what claims to be so liberated or liberating or libertarian, what claims to be about freedom is really this kind of slavish following, especially of these algorithmically shaped neighborhoods. And it just occurs to me how much the term disruption is valorized in, tech startup culture. Like every new technology that's pitched to VCs, promises to disrupt some industry or other, the way Uber disrupted taxis, although whatever, Uber's going to go away soon. So, maybe taxis will come back, but they promise disruption. And I like how your premise is that disruption is exactly what our current phase of digital technologies are like trying to put an end to. Okay, great. We have a question in the Q&A from my awesome student, Yvonne. Yvonne says, thank you so much for coming to speak with us. I would love to know what you think of the accepted TikTok neighborhoods. Users have accepted and identified their communities, on the app. And people are on Book Talk and EduTalk, and they're proud of it. And many comments read, commenting so the algorithm keeps me on TikTok, for example. So people are trying to game the algorithm so they are allowed to remain in their desired neighborhoods on TikTok. So how do you deal with people who like their neighborhood and who manipulate the algorithms to keep themselves insular? And, I don't know if you want to address the idea of like bubbles as insular, as like, I'm sure you don't think that's necessarily, bad. But I think there's this way that the insularity and the homophily is viewed by a lot of, it's like, first of all, understood by a lot of users, like they sense that homophily encouraging aspect of the algorithm. And then they also like try to increase it even because they like their neighborhoods on TikTok.
There's so much there. Let me start with homophily and then talk about what it means to like your neighborhood and how we can understand neighborhoods. So one thing that the book does is go into the history of homophily, right? So as I show, it's a concept that actually comes from studies of US residential segregation. And during the time of the study, the researchers said, homophily isn't always true. Similarity does not always breed connection. They also came up with the term heterophily, et cetera. But they came up with the term homophily by looking at the attitudes of white residents towards living in biracial housing. And they said that white residents, both liberal and illiberal, over-selected each other. And so this was quote unquote value homophily, which drove a lot of what we saw. And in order to make this case, they threw out most of their data, all the responses of the Black residents. So values was something that could never cross racial lines in their view. They also threw out the responses of the white ambivalents, who were the largest category. And so they were looking at precisely, and because they argued that the ambivalence at one point would have to be liberal or illiberal, that this was such a divisive issue that they had to move one way or the other. And so they were interested in how networks form literally by taking masses and then polarizing them, right? And so homophily has been important to understanding that kind of connection, which is just one amongst many. And so part of it is to say, look, homophily isn't everything, right? But secondly, and this goes to the question of community, if you take, as a lot of these networks take, homophily to be true, this is their default, and they say this is because people are just comfortable around people who are like them. This is driven by individual choice. What happens is you actually erase all institutional structures. So what emerges is a situation in which community rhymes with homophily, which rhymes with racism. And the reason why these all rhyme together is because it completely erases institutional structures. And so part of this is to say, okay, what happens when we look at these institutional structures? Then these things are not all the same. And it's important that we move away from this idea that it's quote unquote simply voluntary. Although you could argue in agent-based modeling that you can create some of these situations when you embed all institutional assumptions within the self, which is what Schelling's model of segregation does. But the other argument that I think is really important to consider is the notion of the neighbor was always distinguished from the friend. The neighbor, neighbor comes from literally the term bore, right? Neighbors are boorish, they're in your face, they force you to deal with things that you don't want to deal with. In Vancouver, my neighbor, I live in this high-rise apartment building, we have an ongoing battle over shades, right? This is like this passive-aggressive Canadian, when will you put up your shade, kind of thing. So neighbors provoke a sense of agitation and needing to deal with difference. And when we conflate and just reduce neighbors to friends, what we're doing is actually creating a situation that's worse. Because as Frances Haugen revealed, when Facebook started limiting feeds to friends and family, things got even more agitated. So what's happening isn't that people are necessarily more comfortable and therefore relaxed and happy. They're engaging in comforting rage. And if you think even through this active TikTok, I want this X, Y, and Z, it's this activation that is driving the logic of homophily and also the logic of certain forms of clickbait.
So would you say that book talk isn't homophily in that sense? Like, are you sort of saying, an agential self, direction into a space, into a subset of TikTok is more like friendship, more like virtual friendship than like neighborhoodness, neighboring others?
Well, I think it's interesting if we keep those two separate, right? And then think of ourselves in terms of agents, right? So what's nice about that example is that people are actively choosing rather than being placed into clusters or neighbors, right? So a lot of the neighborhood algorithms try to determine neighborhoods, like determine clusters, in which they presume that everyone in a cluster, which in their language is a neighborhood, has to be similar. Right? So segregation is embedded within the very notion of neighborhood.
Why do people like this level of discomfort, this kind of algorithmically driven rage? I mean, rage is a strong word, and maybe a lot of it is more irritation. But why do people like being irritated, and why does that make social media platforms compelling? Like you just said something like, Facebook, as soon as they sort of put you more into conversation with friends and family, it didn't increase the comfort and caringness of the platform experience. It increased the irritation and the and the annoyance factors. So like, why does that make a platform successful,
Well, I think that has a lot to do with the advertising model, right? And comforting rage, right? So it's not rage, it's comforting rage. It's a certain form of engagement that keeps you going because you have to have some sort of affective intensity that then makes you keep going forward. And what it does is it makes us behave like lab rats. There's a way in which, and we were talking about this earlier before it started, but there's a project that I'm working on now which looks at the history of sentiment analysis. And sentiment analysis emerged from studies not only of women workers, like unruly women workers at Western Electric, but also unruly Japanese internees in internment camps during World War II. And sentiment analysis arose as a way to understand societies under stress and how to manage societies under stress. And so sentiment analysis works, and a lot of this analysis works if you're under stress. And so the underlying presumption along a lot of both of these behaviorist presumptions, which are embedded within social media networks and in the analysis of social media networks, work if people are under stress. And so the desire to create stress is fundamental, and being under stress makes you agitated, and therefore makes you searching for that next action.
And I think, as you said earlier, and you say this in the book, the sort of like in-group and out-group feelings, like the rage has a comfort to it. And I think the comfort, you're arguing, is that feeling united against an other, and that alignment with whoever else is also enraged, similar to you, and then their rage makes your rage increase and spike. It's like, it is comforting to feel that alignment and to feel that sense of, for lack of a better word, like community.
Yeah, and a lot of these neighborhoods and clusters are based on open secrets. So the idea is to provoke you, so you reveal something about yourself, which is open, and being an incel is pretty much an open secret. And then to use that as a way to demand transparent or authentic behavior from you. Once you've revealed this, you have to be authentic, and you reveal you're authentic by revealing that you have no inside, right? So Trump was authentic, and Clinton was sincere but always inauthentic, because she must have been hiding something.
Yeah, I would love to get to those examples in just a second. We have another question from Brian, who asks, please illustrate with the example of algorithms applied to bail. What concrete steps would be taken to use these algorithms to identify and analyze historic bias? And how would that analysis then be used to create a more just bail system?
Yeah, so I didn't look at the bill. The system that I looked at was the one that everyone looks at, which is Compass, right? Which is one that looks at the risk of recidivism. So this is one that's more about sentencing versus one that's about bail. But to be honest, they're the same in terms of predicting certain risks, either of you not paying bail or the risk of you being a repeat offender, quote unquote. So in terms of Compass, what's important is that it was introduced initially as a way to combat discrimination. And the idea was that the problem of racism or discrimination within the criminal justice system, sorry, it's late for me here, was due to individual bias. And it's clear that individual bias does matter. So the classic example is sentencing depends on whether or not the judge has had lunch, right? So a good trial lawyer will get their person up early because you're more likely to get a linear sentence if you go before lunch than after lunch, right? So the idea there was, okay, well, racism too is an individual problem, so we get rid of individual bias through these systems, and then we'll get rid of racism. Okay, but you didn't get rid of racism. Now, a lot of people have shown that part of the issue is that although these Compass does not include race explicitly, what it does include are proxies for race, such as educational status as well as occupation. And I would push back on that and say, actually, what they're showing are proxies for racism, not proxies for race. And people have critiqued, the ProPublica article that showed this by saying, look, actually the biggest factors are age and dirty data. But that actually doesn't go against the argument that it's proxies for racism that matter the most, right? Because age at first arrest has everything to do with unequal policing within the United States and dirty data as well. If you're not in the system, you're not going to have the data in you incorrect, right? So one thing you can say is that what these algorithms show through the results are actually the powerful impacts of racism on the systemic sentencing that people will get. And by looking at which factors matter, you can actually pinpoint those points of racism. Now, having done that, I think the larger question is, in many cases, what's being uncovered are things that we already know. Right? We know that there's racist policing at the heart of this. But one thing that it opens up is the question of evidence, right? If you can show that these are the things that matter most and they're linked to questions of systemic racism, such as over and under policing of neighborhoods, then that can be used as a form of diagnostic. But again, we have to ask ourselves, do we need more diagnostics? And what are the limitations even of this kind of maneuver?
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, I think one thing that is really important for your audiences to get out of your work is the importance of proxies and what proxies are representing. I've had a student, a student who returned to finish their degree after many years in the working world, really get irritated at the implication that there was racism in the real estate industry, because they pointed to all these regulations and all these policies at individual banks, and all these sort of, state by state, city by city policies that ensure that there can't be racism in homeowner lending. But I think what is so valuable about you're calling attention to proxies is that actually using proxies for racism is how these algorithms are built. So no person at a bank needs to decide not to give a person of color a loan. The algorithms already are based on racist proxies and already feed those decisions, very well without the human decision maker. So people don't need to sort of get mad at other people anymore, but they do need to understand what is happening in terms of how these recommendation engines are driven. So that's really great. Okay, let's go back to the Trump and Clinton example and talk about performance, because I am a performance scholar as well as a new media scholar. So I really love the parts of this book that bring performance studies together with new media studies. So I'd love to hear you talk more about the importance of performance to the current era of social media. I mean, I have all my ways of talking about it, but I would love for you to, assuming that there are people in this audience who haven't had the chance to get a hold of this great book yet, if you could talk about how, for example, Trump rose to popularity through these performances of authenticity.
So that's the part of the book, the third chapter, which is on algorithmic authenticity. And there I make a couple of arguments. One, which is that authenticity itself has become algorithmic. The idea to thine own self be true, et cetera, follows a certain list of commands. This is why there's so many how-to guides in businesses, et cetera, on how to be authentic, et cetera. And so I draw a link between reality TV and the drive for authenticity. But part of what I'm trying to do is to not say, okay, bad, performance is bad, but rather performance is actually what enables other certain forms of authenticity to emerge that are counter to this notion that one should be transparent. And here, I think through ourselves as characters or in masks, and that this enables different forms of engagement to emerge. But I think the book is profoundly influenced by performance studies, either through Munoz's work and through others, and the ways in which I'm trying to think through ourselves as characters rather than marionettes within this drama called big data. It's also very much indebted to media studies and soap opera studies, because I think the idea of the world of soap opera in which you had these intersecting narratives that would sort of, and they were important because they would divide your day. There were ways to interact, etc., is absolutely key to understanding the world and universe of social media around us. But when we have this view of ourselves as characters, what this also brings into place is the whole structure, right? So you have props, you have this universe, you have the economic system, you have various exchanges. But for me, what's so key when we think through performance and being online is that it's not simply that our lines are being given to us, but our lines and our characters are determined by other people who are around us. So if you think of the way correlation works or recommender systems work, it's not simply you trying to manipulate the algorithm, but what other people who are deemed to be quote unquote like you are doing. And so there's a way in which collective action is possible, but there's also a way in which collective action is always happening under the guise of undermining all collective action. And so I think that what's so key about thinking through performance and the ways in which we're constantly interacting, the ways in which our technologies are constantly interacting, you're downloading everybody else's traffic, your network card is promiscuous, et cetera, is that it gives us a different way of understanding the ways in which we're always in relation to others.
Wendy, I think you just gave me my Valentine's Day gift, which is talking about how new media studies, performance studies, and soap opera studies all are so important for each other. So thank you so much. Yes, indeed. Okay, so let's talk about eugenics, because that's actually quite a significant body of research you did for this book, was surfacing the triumph over the triumph of correlation over causality as an explanatory model, and how that move was formulated by early eugenicists. So I think it's important for this audience to hear you talk more about that. What does the origin of correlation theory in the eugenics framework have to do with people using social media today?
So what's key about the tools of 20th century eugenics is that it's not just correlation. It's also linear discriminant analysis, which is so key to pattern recognition, the emergence of modern pattern recognition. It's also principal component analysis. There are various basic linear and logistic regression, right? So those are the main tools, and those all emerged within 20th century eugenics. And my argument isn't, to be clear, that anyone who uses these tools is a eugenicist. Because again, if you think about how these tools can be used to diagnose and create gaps, that it leads us to a different way of thinking with them and against them. My point is to say, let's ask ourselves, right? So at the beginning of the 21st century, there was all this big hype about big data, correlation is fundamentally disruptive, it's new, it's going to change knowledge as we know it. And those tools, which were supposed to be so new and disruptive, came from the same kind of hype in the beginning of the 20th century, where they were developed by Galton and Pearson and Ronnie Fisher in order to determine what remains the same over time, so that, and they argued that what remained the same over time in terms of correlation was always nature rather than nurture. To reveal how humans were basically like cows. They could be bred because there was this sort of steady thing, and where the steady thing was always nature. And that by making these kinds of correlations, what would emerge, because these were changing traits. And it's not just, thank you for the comment about economics, it's also this notion of these unchanging correlations and innate concepts also drive the ocean model, which of course became very famous with Cambridge Analytica, right? So the O in ocean actually used to be I for intelligence. But the idea was that because these things were innate, we didn't need to know why, but rather how. And correlation was actually used to show within the world of eugenics that learning was impossible, that intelligence could only be bred. It couldn't be learned. So it's really strange now that machine learning is based off a system that insisted that learning was impossible. And then with linear discriminant analysis, what was presumed was that you had two populations that shared a feature and overlapped, right? So you had to find the best way to discriminate between these two features. This work actually came from an analysis of skulls, not just irises. So R.A. Fisher's famous article starts with an allusion to craniometry, not simply the iris data set, which is used in almost every data science course now. And so there was a presumption of already pre-existing, unchanging races, which then you simply had, but they were mixed, and you had to figure out how best to build walls between them. So if you look at the world that these presume, and more importantly, the history these presume, right? The idea of history they presume, in terms of what can be changed and what can't be changed, and how to change them. That is what is so disturbing. And that desire to close the future, again, is exactly that move to use these to insist that the world can't be different because we could predict, versus the turn that they took in some ways to say that this is what we understand the past to be.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like exactly ad tech's thinking, right? It's like ad tech would love for us to be more clearly divided and more identifiable and more predictable, so that it only has to deal with like 38 types of consumers, rather than thinking about hybridity and mixing and like these unpredictable outcomes. So, I mean, is that right? That like what basically how we got here is because it's easier to push ads to us if we're, you know, one of X types, as opposed to like just being like lots of combinations of things that don't have names.
Yeah, and the idea is like there should be different types that pre-exist. So you start with the idea that there are different types, and you just have to figure out the feature that will make this population clear. Once you've figured out the feature, you can amplify that feature to make the division even more clear.
Right. So as you say, like one of your examples is, wasn't it Bannon who, or no, it was somebody who ran Ted Cruz's campaign, right? That like, as long as you identify two things in common that, you know, among white conservatives who are likely to vote for Cruz, you can like amplify those things up to a point that they will really vote for Cruz. And like, one of them was like, pro-gun kind of sentiment, and the other one was like white supremacy. So it's like if you just sort of say, okay, these are all sort of like active in a white conservative like type of demographic, we could use social media to multiply that feeling, like strengthen both of those like belief commitments, you know. Yeah, which is like great. Okay, so as a closing question, I'm going to give you the choice of either one of these two earlier works of yours that are super famous and are taught all the time, because I'm sure that we have audience members that have read one or both of them. And so I think it would be great to just hear you say a few words about how discriminating data relates to one of them. So the two I'll give you the choice for are your Control and Protocol book or the Race and as Technology essay. Like, pick one and then let us know, like trace out a little bit of the arc between your former work and this new work.
No. Why don't I go, I mean, this one's so hard because Race and as Technology, I was going to insert in Discriminating Data, and then I took it out because I thought it was already there. But I will go with then Control and Freedom, because that's the first book that I ever wrote. And it was really trying to understand that relationship between control and freedom, both at a technical level and at a social level, and to try to understand how they didn't map onto each other. And I think that, so control and freedom started off as sex and sexuality in the age of fiber optics. So it's a distant cousin to my dissertation. And I would say to all of you who are writing PhDs right now, my dissertation was awful. And so it's okay if you write a dissertation and you're like, wow. And because what's great about it is that it inspires more work. Your dissertation isn't the end of your career, it's the beginning of your career, right? And so from sexuality in the age of fiber optics, which was all about why is everything about sex and sexuality, right? Like, why is it always like, you know, male to female connectors? Why is it, what is the relationship between technical reproduction and other forms of reproduction? And this came to me again, and I'm going to relate it because they both stem from my engineering days, right? So the reason, the time that sex and sexuality really hit me in terms of technology was when I was in an engineering work term working on hardware, and I realized everything goes from a male to female connector. And I was like, I can't touch my technology anymore. Like, this is really weird. It was like when everyone started getting pregnant at Princeton during grad school, I wouldn't go near the photocopier, right? Because reproduction is reproduction, right? There's clearly in the air. So I think that what emerged from there in terms of thinking through sex and sexuality, as well as the importance of race, in terms of why was the internet being sold as this utopia, constantly sold to us as this utopia that would solve the problems of racism, and clearly did not. So in that sense, I think that those very much that problem is still with us. And that problem is, again, what discriminating data is looking at in terms of racism and the ways in which both the call to solve problems of racism technologically has perpetuated the situation we're in. And why is it and how is it that we can take on racism and certain forms of technological imperialism at the same time, because they're actually the same thing.
All right, great. Thank you so much for joining us, Wendy. This was a terrific event. I hope we introduced everybody who's watching us live or everyone who will watch us later on our YouTube channel to this great work. Please buy a copy of Discriminating Data and read it a couple times through, because it's gonna blow your mind, change your world. And thank you so much, Wendy Chun, for joining us. Always a tremendous pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be at Berkeley, and I wish I could be there in person. But I should be there hopefully soon in person. So
great. We would love that, and definitely let us know. BCNM will, organize a cool event for you for sure. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.